Oh, like butter, baby. So we're back with the K24 giveaway, and to recap what we've done, kind of explain what bore and stroke and hone and all that other good stuff was. Today we're gonna go over some pistons and rods. We're gonna go over what compression is, and we're gonna go over what makes a K24 a K24. Pistons, rods. I'm gonna point out a couple of things about these pistons. One, they have a really short skirt. The coating is like a protective coating just for wear on the skirts against the cylinder walls. It helps it retain a little bit of oil also. Pin here, it's called a wrist pin. This is a tool steel wrist pin. Tool steel it's self-explanatory. It's the same steel that they make tools. So it's super hard. You know, it's an option when you buy pistons on some pistons. Usually I just get the tool steel option. The last thing you want is a broken wrist pin. And another thing to look out for is how this wrist pin mounts in. This is called a floating pin. So what that means is the pin slides into the piston and it kind of moves. It can still rotate and it moves. And then it just uses these two C-clips in here and here to hold it in place. Floating pins also float inside the rod. So it also goes in the rod and it could still rotate. It could still move. Some rods come with a press pin. What that means is when you put the rod and piston together like this, the pin is press fitted into the rod. So it won't, so once you get it in there, once you press it together, it stays locked on the rod. The rod holds the pin in place so you don't need the clamps, you don't need the clips on the side there. Another little quick tip on the pistons, you can notice that we already scuffed them. Why we do that is when these get all machined and CNC'd out, sometimes it leaves like a very sharp edge, like a knife edge. You don't want that because the sharp knife edges tend to retain a lot of heat, and so there's going to be heat right at those edges. Quick, easy thing to do is just take a little red Brillo and just kind of scuff up the edges a little bit, just like that, and then run your finger over it like that. If they're smooth and you're not cutting yourself, you're fine. You don't have to go crazy on it. That's the piston. These are rods. This is called an H-beam rod. Why is it called an H-beam, right? If you look at it, you see how it's skinny right there and it's fat over here. So technically, if you cut this right here, look at it straight on, it's gonna be an H pattern. The other style rod is called an I-beam rod, which is pretty much the reverse. It's flat in the middle and then it's got the ridges on the side. Again, you cut it that way, it makes an I. So what we're gonna do now is assemble the pistons and rods. We'll put the rings on. These have already been measured at the machine shop. They already been weighed. See, a good machinist always weighs them, tells you how much they weigh. And he's already gapped the piston rings for us because I don't have a piston ring gapper. So I'm gonna assemble the piston rings onto the piston and then put the piston onto the rod, install it into the motor, and then I'm gonna start explaining what is compression because we did change the compression of the engine. Well, these are the lockers for the hole right there. So I'm gonna put those in first, put the piston and rod together, and then I'm gonna put the rings on. Ooh, don't kill me, don't kill me. Oh. Oh, don't kill me. Oh, one. I got one, I got 3 more to go. Good thing we don't have a V8. Piston rings. First one is the shiny one is usually like steel. This is the top ring. Also the first ring right here. See that right there? The second ring is usually dull. It's usually like a cast ring, so you got to be careful not to overstretch these because they can break. The last ring is a 3-piece ring. You see that? it makes a sandwich with this little squiggly guy here and this is called the oil ring, which sits all in here. You get oil all in here. It distributes the oil around the cylinder wall. It scrapes it away. So that's your lubricant from your piston to cylinder wall. The top one, like I said, is compression ring. It's the second ring, and your oiling rings. I'm gonna show you how to put them in. If you notice, they're not completely round. They have this gap in them. So that's when you put this in your cylinder wall, in your cylinders, it usually closes the gap, like that. We already had the machine shop file it down to the right gap, so I don't have to do that here. I'm gonna do a quick explanation of what ring gap is. Okay, this is number one. Number one is always the one closest to the timing chain. V8, V6, all of them same. So if you look at a V8, the heads are staggered, like one further than the other. So number one is always the one furthest towards the chain. So you take the piston, you kind of snake it in there, kind of get it as even as you can, so you got that ring just kind of evenly spaced on top of the deck. That little gap right there, that's your ring gap. Now we're gonna go back, put this on the piston, and then put the whole thing in as one unit. So we're gonna start with the oil rings. It's a sandwich. That one goes in the middle, that one goes on top. This thing has a tiny little groove right there, so you put this one in first, like that. And you see where your gap is? You see where the ring gap is? I usually just take a Sharpie and just mark where my ring gap is right there. Why is that important? Because you don't want the gaps to be all in the same place. So you now remember that one there. I have bad memory, so that I use a Sharpie. So this one will go here, like that. So that gap is here, and I usually try to get this one all the way here at the opposite end. I hate you. There. That's perfect right there. So we know that that's the gap, the gap, the gap, so we know we're all apart, right? Now, remember I told you the second ring, you gotta be careful. It's cast, it's brittle, so just take your time, work it in slow. I don't even know if you guys can see that at home, but there is a top and bottom to this because it's got like a tiny little groove, you see? Right there. See where it's completely flat where the number is? That's the bottom. This is the top. Again, we try to get opposites of everything. So that one goes here. That's the second ring. That's right here. See this? I'm trying to get this. Yeah. See?
You broke it, huh?
No, didn't break nothing. So we know that the second ring now is here. So we got to put the compression ring on the opposite like that. The compression ring doesn't have any up or down, so that's the number. The number was facing down on the other one. I'm going to do the same thing. There. Rings in. Alright, we're about to install these pistons. It's just a rag, a little bit of oil, just to oil up the cylinder walls. This is a piston ring compressor. It's an old school one where like every different size works. So what it is it's basically like a big clamp because you can't put the pistons down because the ring is already expanded, so it'll just sit, you know what I mean? It's like it'll hit the top of the hole. But with this, you compress all the rings in, and it just kind of pushes it all the way in. Once the piston is in the hole, the ring expands back out. So we just popped in number one. That notch goes same side. That's how I took it out, so that's how it's going back in. Okay, I'm just gonna like hand tighten this for now. What I usually like to do is just do them all at once. This way I'm not setting the torque wrench, or did I get it right or did I get it wrong? So if you do everything at once, it's less likely to screw up. For me anyway.
So does that mean you put all the rods and pistons in?
Yeah.
Before you even turn it around?
Before I even turn it around. And I always like to give it like a little shimmy shimmy, just to make sure nothing gets bound up. And as you can see, the way I put them in is the piston is all the way down. So the crank is all the way at bottom dead center, which you can see number 1 and number 4. So, I mean, you could turn it, but I usually just, it's more effective just to do 1, 4, and then 2 and 3. So now instead of doing number 2, I'm just gonna do number 4 only because the crank is already down. Number 4, tighten it up. When you tighten it, make sure it's straight though. Don't do the dickhead move and it's not straight. As soon as you tighten it, it compresses the ring, you see? Pushes the ring inside. Now I gotta do the bearing. Same way as we did the crank. It's got the tab right there, tab right there, and that's it. That's it. Get some lube on it.
Are you sure that's 4?
I'm sure. The furthest away from the timing belt. So when you're pushing this down, try to catch the rod so it doesn't swing all over the place and like scrape up stuff. It's not really gonna do much damage, but I just don't like the fact that it swings around and has a possibility of hitting things. And also, you wanna make sure your rod bearing is still in a good spot. So our rod bearing is still there. All right, before you guys say any shit, because I know, oh, he didn't lube the bolts. Suck it, dick. No. I'm lubing it now. I just put them all together. Now I'm gonna do the torque.
Wait, what are the torque specs on this?
45. A little jammy jam right there, see? You could still, like I could feel it, right? It's still very good. That feels very good. That feels very good. Oh, like butter, baby. Just like to screw on an oil filter. This way nothing gets in there. Plug the hole. Very important. Zero out your torque wrench before you put it away. So pistons are in, and it's time to talk about letters and some numbers and some real like nerdy stuff. Honda makes a bunch of engines. The more popular ones are the B, the H, the F, and of course the Ks. A lot of manufacturers use letters to categorize their engines. Some of them use 2, some of them use numbers in the beginning. I mean, the more popular ones are like, you know, like the 2JZs has the 2, the J, the Z, and the RBs and stuff like that, the VQs. And then there's always the oddball manufacturers that just don't like themselves and they just use a whole bunch of numbers and nobody understands. Honda makes it easy. So Honda does it. There is a letter, 2 numbers, a letter, and sometimes there's a number back here. But for our demonstration here, we're not going to really care about the last 2 digits because it's really not important to what we're trying to say. So this being a K24, there's also K20s and there's also a K23. So what does that 24 mean, right? The one thing I really like about Hondas is they're really straightforward. It's really simple. There's no bullshit. They call things for what they are. They label things for what they are. So it's pretty straightforward. So this being a K engine, which means it is a family group of K, and 24, which means the displacement of the engine, which is 2.4 liters. So that would make a K20 2 liters and a 23 3 liters. So rolling in my 5.0 is technically rolling in my 5 liters of displacement.
Rolling in my 5.0.
So not as catchy, but accurate. And if I ruin that song for you, not sorry, and you're welcome. Let me show you. It's really easy to measure. So we're gonna use number 1. First thing you do is you put it all the way down. Okay, so you put it all the way down and you measure that volume in here, in this cavity right here. And then you take that measurement and you multiply it by the number of cylinders. In this case, it's 4 cylinders. This hole that we know, if we measured it, would be roughly 600 cc's or 0.6 liters. 0.6 liters times 4 cylinders is 2.4 liters. There it is, straightforward. We are building a naturally aspirated engine. For you guys that, you know, hang out in the car show and Walmart parking lot, all motor, right? So all motor means no turbo, no nitrous, no supercharger, no power adder. Because there's no turbo, no nitrous, no supercharger, one of the good ways to make horsepower out of an all motor car is to raise the compression. There's a couple ways to raise compression. Most straightforward, the most easiest way is to do it through the piston. This one you have to kind of use a bit of imagination because it's not all visual and it's not all here. Imagine that the head is on with the gasket. So the gasket has a certain thickness. So this takes up a little bit of a space. So that creates a little bit of a pocket, right? So that little space coordinates to something. And then there's also this chamber that's in the head. So there's a space here also. So the piston being bottom dead center is where the volume is at its greatest. Next, you move the piston to the top dead center, and that is where volume is the smallest. Now, the comparison between those two volumes is your compression ratio. All right, we're gonna do like really simple math, right? So let's just say the piston is at bottom dead center. Remember, everything's on, the head's on, the gasket's on, everything's on. Let's just say that this volume is 10 cc when the piston all the way down, bottom dead center. At top dead center, because the head is on it, remember the cavity in the head and the gasket being on, all the way up. So you measure that, and let's say that's 1 cc. So that makes your compression ratio 10 to 1, simple math. So how does it translate into horsepower? This is the tricky subject because it requires a little bit of like thermodynamics, physics, and some super brain power calculations. We're not gonna get into details because most of it will probably put you to sleep. And even if I try to explain it, you'll end up more confused because my shitty explanation. So I'll give you kind of like a broad overview how it works, right? Simply put, when an explosion happens, it expands. That's thermodynamics and physics and just all that. We'll just keep it at that. That expansion pushes everything around it. That explosion, that expansion pushes the piston down. So in an engine, air and fuel gets compressed, right? It gets compressed as it comes up and then it gets ignited. In a high compression engine, the volume of air and fuel is being compressed at a much smaller space compared to a low compression engine. Engines make power depending how much combustion force pushes down on that piston. In a high compression engine, because the piston is higher in the cylinder during combustion, the more force it creates to push the piston down. More force, more better, more horsepower. We went over volume and we showed how volume is measured. We went over compression ratio, how compression ratios are figured. The next step here would be to assemble the oil pump, put the chain on, put the cover on, put the head on, and go over the bits of the head, what VTEC is, what overhead cam is, and our head being it's CNC ported. What does all that mean? Some of the flow numbers of a head.